We shall be recording this meeting. I hope that is okay with everyone. And if it's not very comfortable for you, you can just go off video. Again, we are very glad to have you join us today. This is our first session of the collaborative learning labs, and we are glad that you could join us. We will start with a simple introduction of what the labs are all about before I can hand it over to Professor James, who is already on the call with us. So good afternoon, good evening, good morning from wherever you're joining us from. It's really a privilege to welcome you to this space. PRA and labs were developed by development practitioners like ourselves who share really a growing recognition that many challenges that we encounter in development are not only technical. I know a lot of us have a lot of conversations on sustainability and how to work differently. And this is part of coming to that realization, but we also realize that these challenges are deeply shaped by how systems and relationships and decisions are structured and experienced in practice. You will notice indeed that despite long-standing global commitments like the SDGs and the Grand Bargain, which led to localization, a lot of our organizations speak localization now, and the broader philanthropy and development agendas really. But again, at the same time, you notice that the sector is shifting, the development sector is shifting. How things were done 10 years ago is very different now, and also with the shrinking donor landscape. And we are really operating in a moment defined by a lot of financial constraints as the development sector as a whole, but also increased pressure to demonstrate impact and growing calls for more locally led and contextually grounded approaches. And these shifts, they create an urgency in all of us to see how can things be done differently, but also they create a real opportunity actually to pause and reflect on how development is actually done and not just how it is described in documents and the reports that we make. And that is the heart behind the Unlearning Labs and PRA in general. We don't really believe that the lab may have all the answers that we are trying to seek. But we know that it will create a space to start to reflect on some of these things. In fact, we begin from recognition that many of the most persistent patterns we actually see in development are not reproduced by lack of knowledge, really. You will see that a lot of these based on assumptions that are embedded in practice. In fact, if you think about it, development workers are by far the most capacitated group of people because we have a lot of capacity building in our work, in our budgets. But this really also highlights the need for unlearning, because whereas we are gaining a lot of knowledge, it sits on what we already know, and we have to create space for what is new to actually make effect in our work. Maybe very interestingly is when we birthed the Collaborative and Learning Lab, it was greatly inspired by Professor James's book, But I Meant Well, Unlearning Colonial Ways of Doing Good. And it informed the labs in general, but also we structure the labs to be designed as a space to surface some of the dynamics that are deep-rooted in the development sector, but to reflect on them together and to begin to explore how practice might actually shift when we make them visible. We are also deeply aware that this work sits within a much, much broader ecosystem. Many organizations, a lot of movements, and practitioners have been really engaging in topics like decolonizing aid and decolonizing development and reforming philanthropy as a whole, and also advancing locally led approaches, more equitable approaches. So we see a lot of people moving towards progressive ways of doing good. And really we see ourselves as part of that wider effort. How can we contribute in the wider effort? And I think for us, we see this through the lab really by focusing on everyday practices that shape how systems are experienced, but also how they are reproduced. We also recognize that meaningful change in development, it cannot be achieved by one group. I really hope that this space that we are creating will allow a lot of development workers to slow down and see patterns that are often invisible in our day-to-day work, and to engage with them with a lot of honesty and also constructively for more sustainable impact. I think that we have a lot of people join us now. I would like to hand over to Professor James. But before I just hand off, I want to emphasize that this is a facilitated learning space, and it is really designed for openness, for reflection, for dialogue, and this is a safe space as well. So there are no expected correct contributions, yeah? Only really a shared willingness to examine how things are and what might be possible if we allow ourselves to see things differently. It's my pleasure to invite Professor James, who will be setting the foundation for this session today and for the consequent labs that we shall be having. So thank you again, and over to you, Professor James.
Thank you, Imelda. It's really wonderful to be with this group. You are my people. The people who are trying to make a difference, who are stepping into the gaps. And so I'm just really honored to be among you. I'm going to be talking briefly because I think this is best done as a conversation, not as a monologue. But I want to tell you a little bit about my background so you know just where I'm coming from, but then also some thoughts about colonialism and how it appears today and how we can begin to resist it or extract ourselves from it. So in my initial work, I'm American, as you may be able to tell. I live in North Carolina on the east coast of the country. And my first time that I spent outside of the US was in the DRC. It was then called Zaire. I worked for a couple of years as a nutritionist with severely malnourished children on a project that was funded by the US Agency for International Development. I did some PhD research on diarrheal disease, and that was in Kenya. For those of you from Kenya, I lived in Embu for a year, my wife and I. And I'm just jumping around. This is not going to sound really coherent, but I'm just trying to bring up some significant points. Later on in my career, when I took a job at UNC, University of North Carolina, I developed a program in public health ethics. I was very much interested in ethics because I was working in communities in North Carolina where there was a lot of very obvious, shocking racism, and I wanted to be able to talk about that in the context of public health. And then I finished my academic career as director of a very large USAID funded project called Measure Evaluation. And that project on any given day was active in 40 different countries, low and middle income countries, where we were helping those countries to strengthen their systems for collecting and using data to guide public health programs. When I retired, I found that I had time to think, to read. And one of the things that I read was written by a Catholic priest working out of Mexico at the time. He was from Europe, but he was working in Mexico. His name is Ivan Illich, some will say. And he wrote an essay called "To Hell with Good Intentions." And he was speaking to a group of youth and of program planners who had brought youth down to Mexico to spend a couple of weeks working in needy communities. And he said to them, "You have nothing to offer here. You don't even speak the language. You're not going to leave an impact. All you're going to do is be a walking advertisement for an American way of living and American standards of consumption." That essay affected me. I really took it seriously and began to reflect on what my intentions had been. I had abundant good intentions. Had they played out well, or had they done more harm? I in reading about colonialism, I came up with my own definition of it, which is systemic subjugation of a people for the extraction of benefits. Europe subjugated peoples around the world to extract minerals, to extract labor. Those are some of the more obvious examples of colonialism. And then as I examined my own intentions, I was realizing that my intentions for doing good were coming from narratives, stories that I had adopted about what good, who is good and where we find good. And a lot of it I found was tied to technology, where there was technological superiority. There was this sense that the people who had that technology were superior, that there is a scale of progress, and that the progress is from primitive to technologically advanced. And those who are on the technologically advanced end were smarter, more innovative. They were coming up with answers that were needed by people seen as non-technological or primitive. I bought into that. I would not have said that so plainly. But when I look back and think about how I went to a very rural area of the Congo to work in nutrition and bring the technological knowledge of nutrition to that community, there were elements of that belief in my head. So that there is this sense of superiority and having answers that then gets combined with a sense of duty, a sense of charity, and these are good things, but they can be spoiled when they're combined with other stories like a superiority or a progress that has a hierarchy of people. So I came to see that development, international development, um, was a form of colonialism. It was a form of making the world more like the West. Speaking as somebody from the West, I would say making the world more like us. Learn to pay attention to nutrition like us, learn to use our technology, learn to use our economic systems and our political systems to progress and to be better is to be like us. That development industry and also large economic processes developed into these mammoth systems of economics, of education, of healthcare systems, of how the environment is treated, charity systems. These systems still exist. They are still with us. They are powerful wheels that are turning. It's hard for us to resist them, but resistance is possible and it's important. And then along with those systems, we develop narratives that justify them. So if I'm walking into a Kenya or a DRC and I am maybe subconsciously carrying this story of superiority and progress and and working with people who are making very little, certainly compared to what I'm making in that very place, I will come up with stories that justify that make it okay for me. Not only okay, but that make it right for me. And those stories we can see them in things like in charities, the brochures or the websites that are developed, the images that are used, the stories that are told that will show how the Westerners are being generous and even heroic. So these stories act as a cover for how we are acting in ways that are not not a level playing field. There's a hierarchy that persists. There is a kind of colonialism. I'm going to talk now just for a few seconds about types of colonialism. There's a type of colonialism that is tied to narratives. It comes, it's kind of an academic word. It's epistemic colonialism. Epistemology is the study of knowledge, how we decide what is true and what is knowledge. And epistemic colonialism, the simplest example of it is anthropologists coming into a country and studying the people of that country and then writing about it and saying, this is what their lives are all about. Saying that for them rather than those people saying themselves what they are about and what they believe. And so the people with power, the academic power, shape how the world is seen and reinforce these ideas of a hierarchy of good or of progress. Another kind of colonialism that's better known, I think, is the use of loans and money to develop a country that come with conditions. Usually those conditions are that the country does less for its own people, puts less money into services for its own people, so that it can put all of its money into repaying loans. That's called a neo-colonialism. So you don't, in that system, you don't have people from Europe moving to India or moving to Malawi or wherever to live and to oversee people. You just have that system occurring from Geneva, from New York, from Washington. Another kind of colonialism is internal colonialism, where the country does it to its own people. America did this. America took over the continent that we live on now. We took it from Native Americans. We were engaged in genocide, killing thousands of Native Americans, marginalizing them, putting them into schools where they were forbidden to speak their own language, forced to speak English, making them progress, right? To be more like the people in charge. That internal colonialism also happens in countries that were colonized. I've mentioned that I spent time in the DRC, and Joseph Mobutu was president of the DRC, and he amassed millions of dollars to his personal bank accounts, dollars that were intended for his people. So he was engaged he had learned well from the West how to subjugate a people for his own benefit. Then so that was internal colonialism. There's also an internalized colonialism. And this is where people who have been subject to colonial systems for a long time begin to see only those. That's the only system they know. That's the only system they can invest in. They can't imagine anything different. They buy into the idea that they are lower on the hierarchy, that others know better than they do, and they just follow those systems. There's a Kenyan author, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, now passed away, who wrote a book called Decolonization of the Mind, where he was talking to his fellow Kenyans about how they had adopted certain colonial views of themselves that they needed to resist. Now I'm going to finish with some words about liberation. Liberation from these systems. when we colonize others and when we are colonized, in both instances, there is dehumanization that is occurring. We become less human by systems that oppress and that view us as primitive, not worthy, not as advanced. But colonizers also become less human because they are relating to people as objects rather than people. And they are losing their own humanity in being in relationship with other humans. So, this project, this need to overcome, to supersede, to transform these colonial systems, it's not just a decolonization of those who have been colonized. It is also of people like me and my ancestors and those who will follow me who are in a very powerful country that is accustomed to exercising its power to find new ways of relating and not just assuming that what we are doing is good, not just inventing narratives and stories that cover what we are doing that make us look heroic. Um, I I think of a woman, indigenous woman from Australia. Her name is Lilla Watson. Some of you will recognize this quote from her. It's very famous. She said, "If you have come to help me, then you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up in mine, then let us work together." And I think that is more of a non-colonial approach to relationships of people like myself learning to see that my liberation is bound up in the liberation of those who have been oppressed. And we need to learn new relationships. Native Americans in the US refer to this as kinship, and they regard all other, not just all other humans, but all other life as kin to them. And naming something as a kin, as a relative, there come obligations of caring for and standing with and being loyal to. And it's these kinship relationships or this kinship mindset that I aspire to now, even across oceans. I'm going to stop there. And as I promised, I wanted to be brief and I wanted to leave time for questions. So I'm sure there are many. I've left many gaps. So let's hear what your questions are. Oh, there's lots of hands. Imelda, why don't I let you call on people?
Okay. As we have Kathy. Kathy's hand is up. I'll also just go through what we have on the chat. Kathy, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you, Imelda, and thank you, Jim, for the presentation. My question goes to the last segment that you've presented on, where how do we decolonize our own minds? Because we find that we've done a lot of work on decolonizing the minds of the others and thinking differently. But we have on our end such internalized colonialist thinking that even when we have spaces where they are built for us, we still do not trust that those spaces are for us. We are so, as if you look at the development sector, we are so trained to keep asking for help that we on our end do not even recognize the resources that we have by ourselves. And so, how then do we go about changing our mindset? Have you come across that kind of setting where people have actually done that?
That's a very good question, Mary, or Kathy, sorry. For a time, I developed a nonprofit that was intending to be a different model, to find a different way. It was operating in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, called Africa Rising. It was not about fundraising. It was about those East African organizations learning from each other. We networked together 14 organizations. We would bring them together once a year and they would pay half their way in transportation. We would pay the other half. There would be a theme. It might be public relations. And instead of coming as an expert from the West to talk about public relations, we would look among the 14 to see who did it best. And they would teach the others. And they could do it in a way that recognized the challenges of their particular context, challenges and opportunities. There's so much more I could say about Africa Rising. It was really rewarding to see these organizations interacting with each other, coming up with collaborations and carrying them out. When I tried to shift the board from America to Africa, frankly, Kenya, we ran into trouble finding people to serve on the board who could see a vision that was different from the usual colonial vision of running to the West to get more money and fashioning their structure and their work all around that goal of getting more money. We failed. We didn't find those people. They probably exist, but we didn't find them. And the organization ended because it just seemed inconsistent to have a board in America doing this work there in East Africa. But it's to your point of what we ran into were people who were so embedded in this model of dancing for money that it was really discouraging. So to your point, though, you need an answer. You need a better answer than that. So, what I talk about in my book is 4 things that I have found helpful. These are not a final 4. These are not, others would add other things. So one of them is questioning, something that you have demonstrated in your question of questioning the system, not just assuming that it is good and right, but saying maybe it's not, maybe it's wrong, and questioning the elements of it. The second point is imagining alternatives. And some of that imagining is in reading up, which we can do amazingly well online now. We can search for things online and find organizations on the other side of the world that are doing things differently. So imagining alternatives. The third thing that I have found helpful is confession. Confessing, you heard me do it in this talk, confessing that I have been involved, I have been complicit in these systems. I'm not clean. And finding a clean place is frankly impossible. We're all working within these systems that are just everywhere. But it's still important to acknowledge, to say it out loud. Yes, I have been a part of this. And then the fourth is resisting, finding ways to, some small, some large, to resist those systems that we encounter. That was a long answer. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Professor James. Just one question, actually about 2 from the chat, but I will go first. When you talked about hierarchy, the kind of colonization that speaks to hierarchy, and I was trying to reflect on that in relation to the development sector, because in the development sector we have a lot of people, a lot of sectors, yeah. So we have the funders, we have the INGOs who are usually international, well established, then we have the CBOs, we have the grassroots organizations, and in these many sectors also exists a lot of hierarchy. And you see that oftentimes these same dynamics of colonialism, they get down to how work is done in the development sector, how people partner, whose knowledge is regarded important in decisions, for example, regarding a project. And it eventually you see that it translates all the way up to down. Yeah. So reflecting on this from a point of a development worker, beyond just mindset shift, which is a really big one, what are some of the very maybe tangible ways that we can that people can start to look at things from a different perspective? Yeah, unlearning is good, but beyond unlearning. But also, secondly, JKC from the chat, he wants to find out what would you call the health data that the USA is requesting to fund African governments. So recently we had a lot of talk around data that African countries were requested to give in exchange for some money. And I think he's just interested to find out if that falls in some form of extraction or colonialism. That is from JKC. Yeah, over to you, Professor.
Starting with that last question, the answer is yes, I do see that. So there is the data collection that I was involved in. I was involved in setting up these systems, and I'm not saying that it shouldn't be, that it's wrong, but there are strong colonial threads that run through it of we have the money, therefore do what we say. If you don't collect the data that we want, then you're not going to get our money. And so there's a we can call it a subjugation. It's a very strong form of control. And for the extraction of benefits, well, is it a benefit that the West gets these data? Maybe there might be some research. That's not the narrative that comes with it. The narrative is collect these data for your own good. But it creates a dependency. The IT industry is constantly changing. So always getting new operating systems, new software programs, new apps, and they consume more and more memory to operate, which requires hardware updates. And so there is so the IT industry is benefiting greatly from having this huge user base throughout the world. I'm not trying to paint a picture that is evil. What I am trying to paint is a picture where these things they're like woven together, and they're so hard to separate. But I'm also trying to give a simple answer to your question. Is there a colonial element to these data systems that we're creating? And I see one. I see one. Now let me turn to your question, Imelda, but remind me what it was. What was it that you were asking?
I think in a summary,
ways of making change, not just those four unlearning steps. Two practical ones that I'm going to mention from my line of work, which is public health. One of them is called asset-based community development, which in English, the acronym is ABCD, asset-based community development. And this is where when working in a community, and this can be, this can be Ugandans working with Ugandans, right? An urban Ugandan working in a rural setting. One goes into this community patiently, not quickly, and listens and learns and observes and interviews and finds out what are the strengths of this community that are available to be accentuated rather than bringing in a system from the outside. As we are working for our INGOs and sent into communities, we can look for opportunities to come with this mindset of the assets of that community to build off of. The contrast that I might make there is this word scale. We talk about scaling up projects. Something that works one place, we believe, well, if it works there, it's not really valuable unless we can scale it up to the whole country. And that scaling is viewing each community as similar to the others. It's not looking at the individuality of those communities and the individual assets. The second one that I will mention, let me retrieve the word in my head here. It's positive deviance. So to deviate from the norm. And to deviate in a positive direction, you can imagine having a group of families who 95% of them all do things one way, but there's 5% who do things in a different way. And those 5% are benefiting from that different way. So they are, those 5% are positive deviants. They are deviating in a positive direction. And there again, it's an example that exists in the community. It doesn't need to be brought in from outside. It's there. And so we just need to find that and find out, how does that exist? How can that be supported? Can it be practiced by other families? Those are two practical examples I would give.
Thank you so much, Professor James. I really like the part of positive deviance. And it really puts emphasis that regardless of how small the change is, it's able to catalyze into more change. So like Kathy had earlier mentioned in her question, how do we start to change internally? And I think that is also what we envision for the Unlearning Labs, where we have individuals that are making efforts to change internally and then catalyze the change in the system that they are in. Thank you so much, Professor James. Festo had a question. He says, is development aid really for the development of the third world? Speaking Fingers says it is a mind shift that requires ongoing conversation and accountability. Example is how many of us will hold ourselves to look out for one and for another. Yes. Okay. So Festo says his worry is, his question was, why is development aid really for the development of third world countries? Because the processes are always very difficult. I think he has added like, yeah, that is his question.
That's a very important, very big, very challenging question. It brings us back to this place where there is, we so want, I'll own this, I so want clear answers. I want a clear evil and I want a clear good. So the movies, films that I will watch, they tend to create characters that are clearly evil. You know, they'll start out and they'll show how bad this person is because they're killing children, they're doing, you know, all these evil things. And so then we, the viewer, recognize, okay, they are pure evil. They deserve to die. Now let's get on with how we're going to kill them for the rest of the movie. We're going to hunt them down and kill them. And it's based on these false ideas of having a clear villain and a clear hero. And boy, it's just not that clear. You all in this talk, you all are embedded in colonial systems like development that is based on ideas that are not entirely good, that are self-serving for the West, especially the West. And yet you are also heroic, self-giving to others. And it's hard for us to be both of those things at the same time and try to shift in a good direction within that larger system. So this question of whether development is really for countries that are low and middle income, Let me just give you a little bit of history here. I'm trying to think of how to do it briefly. Um, so the development industry came after World War II when the West had destroyed the West. The Europe was devastated by bombing. And so they developed this program to rebuild the West. It worked. When Westerners are taking care of Westerners, it's like, a brother taking care of a sister. It worked. And then they turned their attention to other parts of the world. It became more north-south at that point, the north looking at the south. But the differences there were much greater. The contexts were entirely different. The cultural histories were different. So the model of development that came down to from the north to the south didn't work nearly as well. It would work for countries that didn't really need help because they were improving on their own. And other countries just got stuck in certain ways of living. So that's the historical part I want to say that the development. All right, here's one more cynical point I'm going to make. Forgive me, this is a cynical point, but um, in the food industry, they're developed in the West, the Green Revolution, the development of lots and lots of food and maize, and too much for the West, and so we needed to export it, and it went to developing countries, and here we get the World Food Program and the sacks of maize that get distributed there. That's an example of how development is done for the West, exporting these foods to a larger market so that it will come to the West. But there is also a non-cynical element. There are many people, I have interacted with many people in the offices at USAID, at the World Health Organization, even the World Bank, who care deeply about bringing good to the communities that they are working in. So I return to my starting point. There's no clear evil, no clear hero. But yes, there is an element of development that is not for the countries being developed, but for the ones doing it.
Thank you, Professor James. So lastly, as our time is coming to a close, as the global funding landscape undergoes significant transformation, how will the role and the structure of NGOs evolve? Where will the next wave of opportunities emerge? And what strategic positioning is required to remain relevant and impactful? That is from Joseph. And then Yasmin just wanted to appreciate you, Professor James. Indeed, we are all embedded. That is what she says, there is no purely bad or good. Yeah, it is when we are conscious of this tension that we can all be more reflectively and question how we do things, as well as all continue to strive and serve. So one last question from Joseph. Yeah.
Joseph, yes, can I start?
Yes.
Yeah. So Joseph, a few years ago, gosh, maybe it's only a year ago, USAID was dissolved, and um, it was a big shock to the system that I had known. Remember when I started in public health, I started in the DRC working a very small project funded by USAID. And then later I ended my career with a big project funded by USAID. So I have many friends and colleagues who were part of that industry. And when USC was dismantled, just boom, like that, um, it just it confused all of us. And I had retired from UNC by that time, so I was, safe. I didn't have to find a new job. but dozens upon dozens of my colleagues who have been trained to work in INGOs in the development space were lost. They had to dig within their experience to find other things that were employable. Um, and I and at the same time, so that was really sad. It was hard to watch. I got lots of emails about, can you write a recommendation for this or that, which I did. But at the same time as I was lamenting these losses, I was also wondering, was going back to the previous question, was USAID colonial? And is the dismantling of USAID decolonization? Is it an example of decolonization? A painful one, but is it? I don't have a clear answer to that, but I think it's a question worth asking. And the question that follows is, well, so it's gone. What comes next? And I want to point to this gathering that you were in right here, that was formed by Imelda and maybe a few other colleagues. This is an example of taking a different perspective, of talking to each other, learning from each other, of looking for supporting each other, looking for different ways of doing things that I think will begin to bubble up. They will start small. You may start doing something that feels insignificant, but I believe that in some of these, you're going to begin to see change. You're going to see change in mindsets. You're going to see change in the effects in the community. You're going to see change in the relationship between the community and those who are working with the community. I believe that if we are stripping away the old model, and if we had a hard time imagining anything different from that model, that the pain of losing that model, of losing that pipeline of money, is going to force us to imagine new ways of doing things. And I think that this gathering here is one example of that.
Thank you so much, Professor James. So, lastly, this gathering is one of many sessions that we shall have for the collaborative Unlearning Lab, and the keyword there is really unlearning. Yeah, we want to have these sessions with development practitioners embedded in different levels of the development sector to interrogate, to look at, for example, how is partnership being done? And for the next couple of sessions, we just want to explore how partnership is being done in practice, and especially building on that aspect of hierarchy that you talked about, Professor James, and how are those aspects of hierarchy affecting achievement of sustainable impact on the ground. So that is a topic that we will be delving deeper into in our consequent sessions, centering it around partnership in practice. And maybe just before this session comes to an end, if you could share like one to three things that we can keep in mind as we start this unlearning journey with development practitioners.
Yes. This is a question for me?
Yes.
Oh boy, okay.
For everyone.
Okay. So I would mention a few words. One of them is courage. Courage to try something different, and recognize that the systems that exist often will not reward you. They will not make you feel good about being courageous and different. They will maybe label you as non-compliant. And so I want to mention courage, and I want to mention grace. Grace to yourselves, that as you try, you will fail. And don't beat yourself up over that. give yourself a moment to be sad and to lament and to feel bad, but then brush off the dust, stand up, and try something else. And with that, and of course, grace with those that you are working with as you're trying to find these new ways of doing things. Remember that nothing is pure. People may criticize you and look at what you're doing and say, yeah, but it's still colonial. And they'll be right, but the goal is to be less colonial, to work in that direction. And so I just leave you with those two words, courage and grace.
Okay, so we have just 4 minutes to the end of our session. Just a couple, 1 or 3 announcements. If you would love to read Professor James's book, it is available in Ethics Press, and the link is on the chat. You can just look through the chat. You'll be able to access the link to Professor James's book that I meant well, Unlearning Colonial Ways of Doing Good. For me, it opened my mind to a lot of perspectives. It just opened my mind to a lot of things. And I would love for a lot of development workers to read it as well. It will give you a totally different perspective to doing good. Then also, we invite you to follow our LinkedIn page so that we can keep up to date with the next sessions that we will be having. Our next session actually will be exploring decision-making in development partnerships. How does that look in practice? And exploring it much further in our next session, which will be on the 20th. And if you would be interested in joining us, the link is equally in the chat. Just you can fill through the registration, and we look forward to engaging with you. This session will be facilitated by Tori. It's also a partnership with Aid for Aid Workers. So we look forward to interacting with you on the 20th. And then lastly, we are doing a small study to understand how partnerships really work in practice. And we have a small survey that we would greatly appreciate if you're able to fill it. The link to the survey is also in the chat. It takes about 4 to 5 minutes. We are trying to really, based on data, understand how development partnerships happen in practice so that it informs our consequent sessions of the Unlearning Lab. So the link is in the chat, and would greatly appreciate it if you fill it up. It would take about 5 minutes. So that brings us to a close of this session. And thank you so much, Professor James. I'll just look at the chat again. And then we have something from Matthew. Resource partnerships, not limited to funds, is an approach that is picking up. Also working on increasing unrestricted funding streams. And Jonathan pointed out courage and grace indeed. I also add a voice to that, courage and grace indeed, yeah. And thank you. A lot of people are just appreciating the session. Thank you again, Professor James, for joining us for this first session and for giving us 1 hour of your time. We appreciate it. And thank you everyone for taking our time to join us today for the first session of the Collaborative Unlearning Lab. And we look forward to engaging with you again on 20th. Continue to share your thoughts with us, interact, engage with us on LinkedIn. We would love to hear from you. Again, this is a very participatory session that we are trying out. And we are hoping that we can continue to engage with all of you. Thank you for joining us.